Hi everyone, welcome to Tech Talks. Today we're here with Dario Nardi and we're here to go over the ISTJ subtypes. We'll be starting with the dominant subtype. And so Dario calls this the dedicated captain. And so this kind of ISTJ is more densely wired at the front of their brain, and they're correlated with the Helen Fisher's hormone, testosterone. And so Dario, feel free to take it away.
Yeah, absolutely. It's my delight to talk about ISTJs. There are, well, at least in America, many millions, probably a couple tens of millions of ISTJs. So I think we really need to give them our due. My dad was ISTJ preferences, passed away now. I have an aunt and a great aunt who are ISTJ. I have a coworker, also ISTJ. I'm sure many of you could say the same thing. So really, this is a great chance. Also had a landlord at one point who was like really difficult ISTJ. So they're not all wonderful all the time, but let's talk about them. And starting off with this dedicated captain who is more driven and more confident, and I would say has this like extra little boost of charisma combined with deep-seated values that come together really nicely. So it just as a reminder in our series that although our focus is on the type and the subtypes, that there really are these Jungian functions, this pattern of functioning underneath, and that we really want to talk about all of the functions coming into play in some way, including their opposites. So for ISTJ, that's ENFP, and asking where does that inner ENFP, that deep sort of buried ENFP come out? And it comes out in this like a charisma and this drive with the values that come behind it. So when this ISTJ stands up and speaks, they're speaking from a place that people are like, wow, that really like gets to the heart of the matter, whatever it is. And really like can be very inspirational, and people may be shocked where this is coming from because they're like, well, this isn't the mild-mannered ISTJ stereotype, or maybe the person that we see every day. So in terms of the dominant style, yeah, there is more testosterone there and a little bit more driven and confident. And they really, what stands out brain-wise is these strong managerial skills. And then that's a reminder, like I remember one ISTJ who came in for brain imaging, and just looking at the results, I'm like, you have a lot of managerial experience, don't you? And she said, oh, yes. She says, I may be an introvert, but I had 20 years in a managerial position. I need to learn all of that. And so it was really great just hearing from her life lessons and how she described what it took to become a manager. Because for introverts, I don't think that's built in, and it's something that, well, maybe for extroverts too, could probably also take classes in management from the introverts who learned how to make it work. But that's for another time. So one of the things that I see with the managerial stuff is this balance between context and sort of the absolutes. And what we see here with this dedicated captain is, for them in there, I mean, with a lot of SJs, STJs in particular, there's these very sort of strong, clear lines that are there, like a hard line or a red line that you don't cross. And they're aware of what these are. And at the same time, there's the demands of here and now. And so this is something that this is what they've grappled with and learned to work with. And so some of that really then comes in also like processing what's going on with people, sitting down, talking with somebody, hearing what's going on in terms of voice tone and intention, and selecting words that are like inspirational and like reaching the person. And what I noticed is that even though they're ISTJs, that their opposite type, ENFPs are the type that have most likely this creative starburst pattern. Like anybody who's creative subtype by definition is going to have this, but ENFPs like super, like just, this is something that they always have somewhere in the background. Dedicated captain, ISTJ, one of the things that they show is this quiet, sort of like hidden starburst pattern. And that's when all of the regions of the brain are working together simultaneously, sort of like how an ENFP would work. And it's not something that's going to show up in conversation necessarily, maybe as like a very subtle little joke or something like that. But it is something where they're connecting the dots in the background. So like, here's a new idea. Here's like a little piece of a sense of humor. That's the way that it tends to come out. I would say something really cool about them, and what comes to mind, actually, so my aunt-in-law, also ISTJ, is this like, she has a background as a hospital nurse and a nursing teacher. And what I find so interesting about these folks is they usually are going to rise to this managerial or administrative role. And they're also the people who have the full roster of technical skills that ideally should go behind that. I have to say, as an INTJ, having a lot in common with ISTJs, nothing annoys me more than seeing a person who goes directly into administration or management and actually doesn't know what they're administering. The captain ISTJ is somebody that you can promote that actually will have usually all of those technical skills behind it. So they very much understand, like the moment something happens where they're like, oh, we need an extra hand on the floor, so to speak, they're there. Like they know what to do, and they can be that administrative person. So yes, they can do teaching, along with what the managerial stuff is. And behind the scenes, when you look, you're going to find that they're going to have some kind of technical skills. And then this also, their big concern though is being moral exemplars. So it's like, how can I put forth the best example possible? And unlike some other types who might just pop into a role and be more concerned about like ego or power or something like that, money. And I'm not saying there aren't corrupt ISTJs, but that generally speaking, the moral example is important to them, and that they can be surprised or even disappointed by complacency, by corruption going on around them, below them, above them. And they are, because they do have this dominant style, they are usually, ISTJs will step back and try and be separate from politics. But in this case, they really are the ones that are going to sort of step up and try to address it in some way. Be sort of like the army captain who is now a veteran who is going to run for Congress and do something, like actually want to contribute back in a big way in a leadership position. The last thing I would say about them is, we talk a lot about the front of the brain, and they have this left bias because they're more analytical, like extroverted thinking types, the TE function. They do have some back of the brain wiring, a little bit here and there. It's sort of sparse, but they're still sort of reflective in their spare moments. And usually that wiring back there is a little bit odd and irregular. Like the middle and front tend to have this really nice, solid pattern to them. And then the back, you're like, what's going on there? Like something's going on. So I imagine that reflects a little bit of their like quirky side that we don't see, but it could be their thoughts going on in the background, or their observations, or there's sort of like their weird private life habits. That yes, ISTJs, I'm looking at you. I know you've got a quirky side to you that you hide from others. And that's part of what's going on there too. So I would say it's a type that could be confused for ESTJ, and maybe even a little bit, adjacent extrovert types are there, because ISTJs do care about community and that kind of thing in their inspirational moments. But this is one that maybe is going to defy some of the stereotypes of ISTJ.
Yeah, I could totally see that. And so them having that inspiring quality and having a quirky side, people could definitely mistaken them for another type. And so with the dominant ISTJs, what kind of careers would cause someone to more lean into the subtype, especially for ISTJs?
Well, I think a big thing about the subtypes is remembering that they are reflecting development, and certainly opportunity is a big part of it. So there is an element of ambition, whereas, say, the normalizing ISTJ is not particularly ambitious. So I think some of it comes about in the combination of like upbringing, expectations, socioeconomic status, like in the opportunities that come with that, um, and just like the hormone levels, and definitely they want to be in a position where either they can interact with people who are in leadership positions, or where they can move up to a meaningful sort of managerial or leadership position. So otherwise, I think that when I looked back at the sort of the resumes of these people, they usually started off like every other person in that profession, like as a nurse or accountant or something like that. Is just that they tended to be either like pushed in that direction and did not resist it, or they were more actively ambitious. Like there was this element that I mentioned of being a moral exemplar, and wanting to make some kind of impact, having a certain charisma that made them stand out. So instead of being very quiet or pushing people away because they're obnoxious or something, that in fact people are like, oh, we should promote this gal or guy. And I think that that's a big part of it for any of the introverts to move into dominant. Is one is to have that ambition, but also have the opportunity.
Yeah, makes sense. Makes sense. And so it seems like this ISTJ is one that tends to be more ambitious, move up the rankings, and tends to have a stronger personality in comparison with other ISTJs. And you can also see that tertiary introverted feeling coming out, that strong moral fiber that they'll be voicing. So,
Yes, yes, and I feel like that's where we may see a difference with an ESTJ. ESTJs tend to have I mean, they also have introverted feeling in the inferior position, and it does come out introverted feeling with ESTJs, but it tends to be in a very sort of simple black and white way. We're doing this. This is not right. Like whatever it is. ISTJ tends to have a more nuanced understanding, and that's sort of why I opened up with this idea that they have these lines, uh, and they have these values and ideals, and at the same time balancing those with context. And there's more like nuance and consideration about what is it that we're going to do in this situation. And that can actually mean, whereas the ESTJ is not going to agonize over the decisions they make most of the time, very rare for that to happen. ISTJ is going to, I mean, the dominant, but all of them to some extent, going to agonize over these decisions, especially in a leadership position.
they're going to give it a second thought more, agonize over it a little more because they want it to be more congruent with their values, and it's very, very important to them.
Yeah.
And they're okay with sitting in it.
That's a very, yes, they're okay with sitting in it and not jumping to the first reaction, but saying, that introverted feeling is more developed, and there's going to be more complexity to it and nuance to it, and being like, yeah, I want to explore this feeling, not just go based on what my beliefs were since I was 5 years old or whatever it is, and then just that's the end of it, like no discussion needed. They will reach that point eventually, but they really can sit within the feeling, as you said, a lot longer.
Mm. And so that takes us to the creative subtype of ISTJ. And so Dario calls this the enthusiastic prospector. And so this ISTJ has a starburst pattern in their brain, and they're also correlated with the hormone dopamine.
Yeah, so I'm really enthusiastic to talk about this version, one, because I am also the creative subtype, just a different type. But I managed to corral my dad to do a brain imaging session before he passed. And when he did it, he was very much like good mentally and fit and moving around and doing things in life. And he was, I don't think he was the creative subtype all of his life. I'm quite skeptical of that. But in the last few years, I absolutely could see that. And that's how he came out in terms of the brain imaging results. So that was a very cool, like, close example. Of course, there are other people in the database, ISTJs, that also showed this pattern. So what is it meant by enthusiastic prospector? Well, one of them is that they are more exploratory and open-minded, and usually there's a bit of travel and a bit of socializing that's more than other ISTJs. That they're comfortable with not everything being like planned out or written out in advance, something like that. So my dad, for example, in his last few years, that he was going to give like a talk, for example, as he would do a couple Sundays a month. And he would think about it over the course of the week, and he would jot down a few notes, like literally just a few notes on an index card. And then he would just stand up and like tell a story and integrate things that people had said and like capture what he wanted to say. And all of that was pretty off the cuff and just sort of flowed. And even for ISTJ, he would bring in things that you would think of as like, oh, is he really going to like use a Star Trek example? Or like some, bring in some jokes and like that kind of stuff. And all of it just like flowed very much. And the purpose, he had like an introverted feeling purpose, but presenting it in a very like extroverted, intuiting, sort of fun way. While also having that 1 week of preparation beforehand, and doing his like book research as ISTJ. So what we see in the pattern here is there's still like a bit of a left and a back brain bias. So a little bit more analytical and reflective than the average person in general, which is what we'd expect for IT types of any kind. But then also having a sort of a soft starburst pattern, not the full-on ENFP or the other intuiting types like full-on pattern, but still having the soft starburst pattern in the back. And also, unlike some intuiting types who have a really strong starburst pattern and just sort of lack the social skills that are needed to get through everyday life, which is something we also can see in the brain imaging. Like there's just certain essential skills people need to have. I call them a halo. That they have this halo. So they have the soft starburst of creativity, but they're also socially well adjusted, and they have all the basic skills that are needed. And when you meet them, there is this congratulatory, interested, enthusiastic, supportive, like, oh, what are you doing? That's so interesting. It comes across as being more open-minded and even like supportive or facilitative if it's a work situation. Rather than like, oh, let me check my notes and this was not part of our plan. They're not like that. Obviously, on some very big things in life, like when they're going to buy a house or whatever it is, they're still thinking in the background about that kind of stuff. But there really is a sort of fun style. The starburst pattern, the creativity that comes with it, or say curiosity, open-mindedness, it does take a few extra seconds or minutes. It's not boom, boom, boom like this. Unless I suppose they're like drunk and very much in their element, then the brain tends to soften up a little bit and people get more fluid. But there is this, they still need to absorb a little bit what's going on. And then the other thing is like, where is the creativity coming from? It's not coming from, let me pull from the environment and make something up right now. Or with INFJ or INTJ, it's sort of pulling from a database or storehouse of archetypal impressions and the world of the unconscious. No, this is drawing from this giant, very diverse and varied storehouse of memories, knowledge, skills. And there's almost like a self-fulfilling cycle or prophecy that happens because they travel more and they talk with more people and they're more open-minded. The database ends up being more diverse. It's not this repetitive, for 50 years I did the same thing, and it's just a very solid but small database with a lot of detail in it. How were those forks polished? This is a much more varied and diverse database of experiences, of memories, and that gives them a more fluid and casual and engaged style because they can relate whoever they meet or whatever was going on, like, oh yeah, there was an experience like, or oh yeah, somebody did mention an idea like that. Oh, I read a book about this. It was very interesting. Or I saw a TV show or a movie or what in that ad. So they have this really like rich, wide database, which is really cool. And in this sense, they can look a little bit more, not just open-minded, but more of a perceiving type, especially in a social situation. Or more like an extrovert because they don't feel like, oh no, I don't know how to respond. They have lots of responses and they have this curiosity that goes with it. Of course, if they're really out of their element, if there's nothing to connect it to in the database, then they are going to be, well, let me just sort of wait and see and absorb the situation. And I would also say, like, their opposite type, ENFP, that they want to avoid unhappy memories and elements in their database, which is going to happen because when you do go out in the world more, you travel and explore more, you're more willing to take a few risks, then they're going to have some unhappy experiences too. So that also means that there's a little bit more to trigger on that may not be like their most positive things to think about. I've also noticed, just thinking of another person in particular in the database, that, and just looking at the brain wiring, that the executive skills for emotional management are not quite as strong as the other ISTJs. And so when there is something that pings this negative memory or experience, that they can also lead to sort of an emotional outburst. That of the 4 subtypes, they're the least emotionally contained or stable, which is the cost of being more open-minded and exploratory for them. I'm not saying it's like a big deal, but it's just something to keep in mind, that they're a little bit more volatile compared to other ISTJs. I'm not talking about like, extremely dramatic or something, but for an ISTJ, like, they can be a little bit dramatic at times. Career-wise, people will be surprised to hear, for example, that in college they were an art major or a psychology major, that they did like history, acting, journalism, painting. Like, I look at what these people majored in, I'm like, wow, okay, because one is SJs, they took seriously the idea that college is about absorbing something cultural from the past, and they're like, oh, this is my opportunity to expand my horizons and not just go directly for the undergrad business degree. Although they usually, when you look at it, you're going to see also those STJ, like business, accounting, whatever it is, as a minor or as a graduate degree, or maybe they actually did the art or music as their academic minor, for the college types. And ultimately, they may go into something like, say, working in an organization and be like industrial organizational psychology, or part of a group, and be somebody who might do, and this is certainly possible. I mean, being in Hollywood, I had a chance through one of the acting teachers to advertise to students, and ISTJs do go into acting. Like, that's a thing. Let's not just say it's only NFs that do acting, or SPs or something like that. And they will go into something that balances the technical elements and the capacity for detail along with that interest of the world, which something like journalism can meet and can do, and the arts. And then that's very nice, because then they're in a profession where they're the weird one. To be an ISTJ accountant they're not the weird one, but to be the ISTJ actor or journalist or musician or whatever it is, that they may be then a little bit like, yeah, you can have an ISTJ rock musician. And they're loving it because they're bringing this, like, they're living the adventure that the other ISTJs sort of sit at their desk wondering, like, oh, what if I went on an adventure someday? And now I'm talking about adventure for SJ type. So, this is very safe. It's like going every summer to the south of France or to Greece, and this is part of their yearly cycle or routine that they have. And when they're there, they just sort of let loose a little bit, and they get their like cultural exposure and all of that. So let's not go wild in suggesting these ISTJs are like not their type, but they're certainly a lot more open-minded and adventurous than the others.
Yeah, I could totally see this. This could even be an ISTJ who had to move around growing up because their parents did, and so they got used to it. And so they say that with SJ types, they're the least adaptable in the short term and they're the most adaptable in the long
Mm,
term. And so if they're used to change all the time, they can actually grow to expect it. And so it's a
mhm.
part of their routine. And so it's the strangest paradox if it doesn't drive the SJ nuts.
Yeah, yeah. I think at times that it can be, I know an ISTJ, for example, who, not only works full time, but has 3 young kids to manage. And those kids, I think at least 2 or 3 of them are SP types, ESP types that get into trouble. Like every few days, there is another adventure that requires the fatherly adaptation to the moment. And he just sort of has to ride that because otherwise, yeah, just to try and force kids or other people or life events always into a schedule, like that can be very tough, and actually create stress. So the nice thing is about the creative ISTJ is that by being more adaptable and loose, and maybe, and as you said, also potentially trusting, yeah, I can get through this. Like we're just going to handle each thing as it comes up within specific domains of their life. And they get used to that over the course of years. And there are lots and lots and lots, like millions of ISTJ parents who've had difficult children. I mean, from their point of view, and they adapted to it. So I love what you said because, every side, every one of the types has different sides to them, and we can think of each of these subtypes as like a different facet or side to them. And ISTJs do have this adaptable, curious, open-minded side. We just have to find a way to reach it and to inculcate that, to allow it to happen.
Exactly, yeah. Because the inferior function is both aspirational and also a point of challenge in a way too. So some ISTJs can look at it as an aspiration.
Yeah.
And yeah, the creative subtype of ISTJ could sometimes look INTJ like to some people too, or to themselves in a way.
Absolutely. Yes. Yeah, absolutely. It's even though I really feel looking at the brain imaging and all of that, that what we're talking about is, and what happens under the hood, so to speak, is the inner ENFP finds ways to come out. But from a sort of like basic MBTI dichotomy's point of view, is that they are the one ISTJ that could score as an intuiting type. And potentially, I'm not going to say a perceiving type necessarily. They could. Most ISTJs, in my experience, score as ISTJ, like they know themselves. But they could certainly come off because they're willing to entertain conversations. And like even my dad in his last few years talked about things he would never have talked about before, like about the future, like AI and Bitcoin and all of these things. Like he was genuinely interested. I don't know how much of that is the inner ENFP. I think it's a bit of the opposite type coming out, but in practice, like to us or to just somebody who's randomly learned type, they're like, oh, that person seems like intuiting type, so they must be INTJ, not INTJ. But there definitely is that look and feel.
Well said, Dario. And so that brings us to the normalizing subtype of ISTJ. Dario calls this the dutiful rule keeper. And so this ISTJ has an even field pattern in their brain wiring. And also, they're correlated with the hormone serotonin in Helen Fisher's work. And so, this is probably the most stereotypical ISTJ out of the subtypes of what you would expect from the average profile description in the Myers Briggs, is what I'm guessing.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. That was going to be the first thing I was going to say. This is the stereotype people have of ISTJs is the normalizing. There, I'm sure there are lots of normalizing ISTJs, so the reputation is earned, and the other 3 subtypes are just reminders that no, they're more diverse than that. Um, I think it's like all of the ISTJ typical qualities: diligence, loyalty, detail oriented, serious, sort of a little bit like I want to say like reserved or defended. That they very much have this chart the course style. That they really need to have their pens lined up in a row and even, and so there's a little bit of an OCD quality there. What we find is that their attention to roles, rather, so the challenge of the dominant ISTJ in their leadership position is they have a lot of responsibility for the people below them, as well as they're thinking about the people who may be above them too. For the creative subtype, they're aware of their roles, but they also have like an element of looseness. Like there's the very important roles, which is usually family members or bandmates kind of thing. And what we find, and not necessarily anybody else, and what we find with the ISTJ, this normalizing the family, the work, the community, that all of these different roles are all important to them. So they take just as seriously their role as, say, a deacon at church as they do a father to their children, or mother to or wife to their husband. And then in their workplace, it's the same kind of thing. And so, yes, they like having an umbrella. And that's so beautiful, this idea of life insurance, and the classic view of life insurance as being an umbrella in a big organization and work. But I think that if we want to really talk about normalizing in general for all of the types, but particularly ISTJ, to understand that really it's the whole community and all of their roles that falls under this umbrella, which can have a certain stressful element to it because they're torn in these different directions, and so they're going to be the ISTJ that hears from their spouse, well, you're not spending enough time with your family, because they're doing their other things that are work related and maybe not very good at saying no to those things. And then there's the community things that they volunteered for, because unlike INTJ, who is a different temperament and doesn't really care that much about community, except maybe in like a very either broad humanistic sense or their very specific professional community, which is not the same as their job or workplace. That ISTJs, being SJ temperament, the sort of stabilizer guardian temperament, like community is very important to them. This is part of the structure of existence, the culture, duty to what is it, family, God, and country, and all of that entails. And so they really need to have this brain that is very much stabilizing and steady, and that is stress reducing. And for them, it's like, because all the normalizing subtype folks, like they have an endurance to them, and how do you maintain that endurance is really how do you keep up that umbrella for years and do all the other things that you need to do, is you have a brain that's like very steady and addresses all of the necessary points without getting too wild in one direction or another, if that sort of makes sense. So like other ISTJs, they have that little bit of left bias, more analytical, little bit of back bias for the contemplation, and yet overall, like very much this even field of connections, that every part of the brain is once, it talks to its neighbors, and no more and no less. And so that gives like this feeling of the ISTJ that's like, really, like the classic stereotype is like, has some technical preferences, but is just very steady, measured, and is going to be the accountant who works in a cubicle, or the computer programmer. They could also be a doctor or engineer or lawyer, lab scientist, nurse, teacher, technician. The folks that fill all of these very necessary roles of responsibility that take a lot of experience to build up, and that are not well served if the person is overly ambitious or chaotic or needs variety. Like we need people to be like lab technicians, for example, that don't need variety, because we want consistency of results that are actually reliable. So how do we do that? That are willing to do as a computer programmer. Like I do computer programming as INTJ, but I would be terrible working at it because I love building prototypes and I hate doing all of the documentation and commenting. like the maintenance of software. That this ISTJ is gonna be like, no, I know how to do that. Like anybody with serotonin, there is this attention, even among introverts and thinking types, to the prospects for the organization. This like, I want even if they're not that close to their coworkers, they want the company to succeed, and they want the group to do well as a whole. And they're going to do what they can and sort of stick to this really solid routine in order to keep up the energy that's needed in order to serve all of the roles that are there, because they're going to go to the gym in the morning or at lunch or whatever after work, like whatever their physiology works best for them. And they have to do stuff with their family in the morning and in the evening. And they probably have community stuff that is, in any one of those times a day too. And then the work things in the middle of the day off usually. And they might even take a second job. And that's also, as long as that, even there are people who will take a third job. And as long as that can be like scheduled in, and it can be simple and in the sense of being straightforward and steady, and it repeats day to day, they're like, I can do this. I can handle all of these different things. Now, in order to handle it, I'm a big fan of this. How does humor come across for the different temperaments and types? And for all of the NP and SJ types, like they need a sense of humor is essential to endure life's difficulties. SPs tend to, and I think NJs tend to move away from difficulties. They're like, I'm going to rearrange my life so that it's more pleasurable. Whereas ISTJ is going to have this sense of obligation as a value. And so how do you deal with life pains and inconvenience? They're not going to be sitting there complaining all the time unless they're really, really pushed. So it's that quirkiness and that little bit of sense of humor and the small everyday things, what are traditionally called dad jokes. The ISTJ is especially normalizing is the cultivator, but I think it's for all ISTJs of dad jokes, which could be mom jokes too, by the way. And I also think there's a funny thing that comes out. And because they hold this more rigid sense, like remember that normalizing and creative are opposites diagonally, whereas the creative ISTJ is sort of like more flowing from one thing to the next and just sort of paying attention to like the few big pictures. Making sure that their suitcase is packed properly and all of that. The normalizing ISTJ is more rigid, and they're trying to keep down and manage all of these things. And they're going to break at some points. And the break is not necessarily, it could be an emotional breakage where they have like an anger outburst or something like that, because all of the TJ types like have an anger element to them, as Carl Jung described in his discussion of extroverted thinking, which is the TJ types. But it can also come out in that inferior function outburst of extravagant or imaginative, childlike, bad decisions in the moment. So this is the ISTJ accountant, let's say 35 years old, still single, very reserved and private. He's been on a few dates and like that kind of thing, but then encounters the ESFP that entices them to make that extremely rash decision in life that they would never normally make, because they're like, oh my God, here is my chance for adventure. And all of a sudden, and because they don't have that body of varied experience or the flexibility that the creative ISTJ has, it's going to look like a big sudden break to everybody else. And they're like, oh my God, what are you doing? That this seems like so spur of the moment, and they have no experience with it. And so inevitably, when you don't have experience, you're going to make mistakes. And then this is the kind of thing that then the ISTJ looks back on years later and is like, oh my God, why did I do that? Like, what was I thinking? And it feeds into this general ISTJ theme of hindsight is 2020 and can be so painful. Because they developed this is their superpower, is this giant database of past experiences. So these things then get folded into the past, and then they get processed really heroically. So the lessons learned in hindsight are heroic, but the path that took to get there, when those breaks happen, they're really sudden and can be take people by surprise, including themselves, surprising themselves.
Very in-depth read into ISTJs. That brings us to the harmonizing ISTJ.
Mm-hmm.
Dario calls this the practical coach. And this ISTJ has the multi-diamond pattern in their brain. And they are governed by the hormones oxytocin and estrogen. And so, Dario, feel free to take it away.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I think I was lucky to encounter a fair number of these folks because, yes, some of the people I drew from population-wise, demographically, were college students, and then later, like all different slices of people and companies and so on. But because the type community, the personality type community, the coaches, counselors, consultants who would come to conferences, like they count some ISTJs among them. Not a ton of them, but they come and they are these practical coach people. And they are not exactly the typical ISTJ. So when you ask them what do they do, and they might be like a skills coach, or they're like a corporate consultant for organizational change. And you're like, wait a minute, that doesn't quite sound like an ISTJ. Well, they are. So this is yet another side to the type. And I think what it is for whatever reason, and it could be hormonally, it could just be also opportunities, or there was a certain interest, like a mentor or something that happened that inspired them, that they really put to heart the training that's needed in order to work with people interpersonally. And I say that carefully, the way that it is, because unlike, say, an INFP or INFJ or ENFP or whatnot, who's like, oh yeah, I naturally have people skills. Oh yeah, I could be a psychologist. Like, I'm not doing that, but I could be. And in fact, you talk to that NF and they're like, yeah, I'm a psychologist for half of my friends anyways, like free psychologist. ISTJ is not free psychologist. Like, that's not the people skills. You sit them down in front of somebody and be like, okay, you need to coach this person through their like marriage and life problems, for example. And when might this happen? So an example would be ISTJ who becomes a minister. And then they discover that actually a lot of being a minister is individual counseling or couples counseling for people who get married. Married couples are coming to them and they're like, I'm an ISTJ. Like, they probably even know Myers-Briggs, because that's one of the tools you're supposed to learn when you go through like learning how to do basic couples counseling for ministers. And then they're like, I am not cut out for this. And either then they're going to just give like basic answers to people, or they're going to be like, wow, I really can dig deep into myself and figure out how to do this, and become a good marriage counselor, or not just like a skills coach, which I think is something that lends itself pretty well to ISTJ, like working one-on-one, but you're focusing more on skills, and or like a careers coach, like what are the career options? There are lots of assessments for these. And in any case, they're going to look for the tools that are needed, and they trust the tools that are needed. And they're the kind of person that, yes, says, I'm gonna use these, like this people technology, in order to help out. So they really rely upon, say, a couple comes in, just continuing with this minister example, and give them both the MBTI. And if they got good training around the MBTI, they learned that the MBTI is only a data point in its results, and that they actually need to like help the people verify their type. And then they're going to have like their trusty book on like relationships and type. And there's a couple of those out there if you search on Amazon. Paul Teager is a person who's published in that area. Some others. In fact, historically, there are some top people, by the way, in the type community for decades, ISTJ preferences, wanting to continue on the tradition, valuing the ability to understand people, valuing like human diversity and different gifts. And then the trick is, what is the training that's needed? So if they really take to heart and they get good training, they can do a really great job. And they are dependent upon those tools. And then slowly, as they engage in it, their brain starts to sort of reshape around it. And I think, when talking about some of the other functions, the sixth function, which I haven't mentioned up until now, but I do think that's an important piece of it. So for dominant subtype, it is the principles of leadership, the core principles of leadership, not just values or beliefs, but like the functional problem-solving principles. Bring in that sixth function, which is introverted thinking. For the creative subtype, it's the principles of, I think whatever it is they're doing, but let's say it is literally something creative like music or art. Like, what are the fundamental principles that are problem-solving, leverage-seeking principles? Again, different from emotions and values. And then for normalizing, they generally are going to absorb some of the principles of whatever professional organization that they're in. But I think they rely upon a lot more upon the rules straight up. The practical coach, harmonizing ISTJ, absolutely needs to bring in their third and sixth functions, be like that emotional rapport building that's there, this awareness of, am I getting the real person in this moment or not? What is very important in these kinds of situations? Understanding the different situations, there's going to be different things that are important. Having some basic problem-solving principles that they can hand to people and say, this is like a really good response to what comes up. Otherwise, people are so messy and complicated, you can't treat them like accounting. So that's not going to work. What I would say also is cool about harmonizing ISTJs as well as the creative is that they still maintain a pretty good, not perfect, pretty good halo of social skills. So the harmonizing or creative, say INFJ or INTJ, and I know, being one of these, the everyday management, those are things that are hard to earn and maintain. I don't like paying attention to all of the everyday stuff that comes up. I do planning. I have to-do lists every day. I strategize things. I do all of that. But it's yeah, I should probably change my car insurance, to something cheaper. That kind of thinking, but in many different ways. ISTJ keeps up all of these things. So the practical coach is, in fact, practical. They're not just a coach. And by the way, the practical coach can include actual athletic coaching as well. I don't just mean a people-oriented, because especially when you need to work very closely. So say it's gymnastics coaching, and every student is requiring this very close attention to technique and detail and that kind of thing. So they're well suited to interpersonal work relative to the other ISTJs. I think that they're good because of the one-on-one interpersonal stuff, talking with people, listening, advising. They also could be something like working in marketing. So how do you speak to people's needs and values? Attending to product quality and customer satisfaction with regard to the human experience. Is this product actually honest in what it's doing? Are people having a good experience? They're the kinds of people in organizations. Let's say that there's a department of engineers and there's lots and lots of ISTJs there. And then somebody comes in from management and is like, we need somebody to do teaching and training. And we'd like to pull from one of the existing engineers. Which ISTJ is going to step up? It's the harmonizing ISTJ who will step up. And they do have a little bit more of that introverted feeling that is more obvious, that will sort of push them to do that. And then their storehouse of experiences eventually includes a lot of people experiences, individual interpersonal experiences. And so they can draw upon that. And then over time, they really build up this huge database of examples that they can point to. Yeah, okay, going back to the minister, couple has come in, or personal life situation, they're literally I have encountered this 100 times before. And knowing and following up with people, because that's what you do when you're responsible, following up, and knowing how this turned out and how that turned out, and then calibrating to that. I would say that the last thing is ISTJs, like all of the IJ types, I think by the time they get older, at least develop a pretty strong like spiritual or religious or at least philosophical side to them that is not cynical. Like it's not they're not like the skeptical atheist gadfly INTP or ISTP. That there really is something very personal, and that this is of the four. This is the flavor you're most likely to actually see it and hear it from them. It will come up with all of the others in some way, but it's the one that is most, it's closest to the surface and is going to drive them the most. And yeah, that's I wouldn't call that a nutshell, but we'll say that's harmonizing ISTJ for now.
Yeah, I could totally see them also growing into that intuition, like all IJs do, developing a philosophy for sure, definitely.
Mhm.
And especially the IJ types have a level of charting the course, as Linda Barron says, for most of them, that they having a guiding philosophy does actually help with charting the course more intentionally in a way too.
Yeah.
All right. And so talking about that, I'm wondering about the key themes you see between all ISTJs, regardless of subtype.
Sure. Yeah. So every type, I mean, we can look at each of the types in a different from different angles, and one of them is the four-letter preferences, the type code, and other ways like the function stack, and there's a much more dynamic approach. We can look at temperament and interaction styles, and we can also look at a more sort of narrative approach, or like what are the core themes that keep showing up in people's lives. And so what do those look like for ISTJ? I would say themes that come up all the time is being prepared and drawing up plans. That will vary somewhat, so that the normalizing tends to be quite detailed and really wants to be prepared in those detailed, whereas say the creative version, it's more like high level plans. They don't need to know exactly what they're doing each time of the day or whatever it is, but there still is a need underlying for preparation and for having plans, at least in a big picture kind of thing. Going through the cycle of life and the seasonal cycle and the mileposts of life, and that also is very much guiding for them, even if it's not the everyday details. Taking responsibility as best they can, which often involves the painful process of learning to say no. And that shows up in different ways. I think for the most part, it's a focus on work first, play later. That's true for all of them. It shows up as being loyal to their roles. And then there's some sorting out by subtype about how, like, in terms of width or depth, those are going to be. So, like, normalizing, there's a tremendous amount of width with the community and like all of these different roles and trying to balance those. The other ones, the loyalty is, say, harmonizing is more towards what is this interpersonal relationship container that we're in right now. Not that they may use those words, but this idea that we're in this like therapeutic or advising space. We're in this interpersonal space. How do we take best responsibility for that? Doing the right thing is really important and often quite clear. Like there may be multiple competing right things to do for different people that pull them in different directions, and it makes it agonizing. But the actual right things to do are usually pretty clear. Some of that comes from like cultural knowledge and then just a history of life of, taking responsibility for things. It's possible to say to an ISTJ, just do the right thing. And that's actually really helpful. I mean, one, they already know that and they say that to themselves, but and this is where they can sit down with an INFP, by the way, which is very helpful. INFP, ISTJ. And the INFP is like, let me help you get a little bit closer to the core of what right is. And because ISTJ can often be pulled in so many different directions that they get off center with respect to who they like what really matters both for themselves and others. So just having that, like a little bit of, I don't say like hugely off center, but it's like a little bit off center. And the INFP comes in and is like, like here, remember this over here? And the ISTJ is like, oh, yeah, of course. Then that makes it very clear. And I think just in general, that polarity of TEFI, like this idea of do the right thing, like morally and practically, is like usually pretty clear what that is. Cultivating good habits every day. I'm not saying that they always have good habits. You know, there are ISTJs who fall into bad habits, overeating, smoking, drinking. Many times those are stress-induced, or their friends did it. They saw their parents as examples of doing it, and instead of going in the opposite direction, they adopted it. That they're really good at, like, once you get them started on doing the right habits, that they really can get into that and repeat it. Like going to the gym consistently for 30 years is a really nice thing. The disadvantage is whatever was not part of that initial habit forming, because there is this element with every human being that your initial exposures often have the strongest impact when learning something new. Like your first teacher, or at least your first two teachers, or the first year that you were doing something. Getting an ISTJ to level up in terms of sophistication or complexity, this is my plea to all ISTJs. Whatever it is that you've been doing for 30 or 40 years, I can guarantee not just technological advancements, but the science of whatever it is you're doing has improved. So, for example, my dad started off as an athlete in the 50s already. He was a runner. Like they had, things that they learned about running. We've learned a lot about running and exercise. One of the things that they did not know or practice so much was things like electrolyte balance. God help me, my brother and I could not convince my dad he needed to replenish his electrolytes, even though the man was like a professional competing runner. Like that just it was not part of the habit building, and it was not part of the initial training. And just like, so is my plea to all ISTJs, please stay current with the science of whatever your habits are, to like actually level up with those over time. Like you don't need to do it overnight, but like, please do this. I think another thing is that they very much, to use like a Catholic or Christian concept, to bear their crosses, multiple crosses, and they're going to be like, yeah, this is life's burden and I'm going to accept it. I'm going to live with it, even though my husband or wife is nuts, even though my kids get into so much trouble, my boss is a monster, the economy is awful. They're just like, yeah, I'm going to bear this as one more burden. And that's just, I'm like, you don't have to do that. You can make a change. And that's where I think that when they can encounter somebody in life who can help them make that change smoothly and comfortably, because they're not a type that wants to make an abrupt change, or if they do, they're usually going to regret it later. They don't trust it because they don't normally do that. It's like okay to get help. My number one statement is, because of the 4 SJ types, they're the type least likely to ask for help. And I'm like, ask for help. I know I can't convince you to let go of that cross. Maybe you can put down one of them and somebody else can help you carry it. Like, it's okay to ask for help. So I think that's a really big theme, is learning to ask for help, bearing adversity. I think we talked about what's planning, planning in advance, noticing what's missing. I'm like, be careful about being sour and angry. Like, I really encourage ISTJs to take a course in like naming your emotions. Like, learn how to name your emotions and engage in a process that allows them to come to the surface, and deal with those. Don't just suppress and push them down. I think that something that maybe surprises people is they do have this subtle sense of humor. that yeah, it can come out as dad jokes, but it also is there. It's a coping mechanism for dealing with the adversity. And I think at times the humor can also go past people, like with INTPs. Like I've known INTPs who have brilliant sense of humor, and literally 90% of the people in the room don't even know a joke was told. And the joke might have been on them, the listeners, by the way, with INTP. They didn't hear it. But ISTJ also has this subtle and like quirky sense of humor that is really great for coping, and is a theme, I think, that repeats. And then, as I mentioned, that learning in hindsight is like physically painful for them. It's like, oh God, like what a thing happened, and it really like torments them until they find counseling and advice and permission in a way to move past it, to give the burden of the mistake to somebody else or to some higher power or whatever it is. That's really, really important for them to find a way to process their insights, their mistakes in hindsight. Because once it's already happened, you can't do anything about it. And then they're like, God, I'm stuck with this situation. What do I do? And it was my fault, and I did the wrong thing instead of the right thing. So their superpower was that moment of weakness, and then where do they go from there? So I'm like, again, it's one of those things. It's like self-forgiveness is really important. I think every type, Joel and Antonia have been talking about this recently, like what is the self-love for every type. For ISTJ is the self-forgiveness.
Yeah, well said, well said. And so with the ISTJ, like you said, there is that form of obligation and duty. And so even if they don't want to do something, if they know that they have to do it or they need to do it or they should do it, they'll force themselves to usually do it.
Mhm.
Even though they have a lazy side that they might sometimes just be like, I want to laze around, I want to be comfortable. ISTJs do have that hidden or overt lazy side depending on the type of ISTJ you run into too, because they do like their creature comforts, and they
Yes.
do ultimately like routines because it allows them to relax, and there's that homeostasis they really enjoy from it. And so, all right, cool.
I would add to that, for all ISTJs listening or people who know ISTJs, um, is there somebody in your life who is taking advantage of your responsible nature? Who's where like, oh, like they won't say no, so I can just get them to do anything. Like, oh yeah, I need some coffee. Go get me some coffee. Like, oh, could you pick up the kids? Could you fly over there and like take care of your parent? Like they're sick, whatever. And I understand like if that happens every so often, but there may be a person in the ISTJ's life who realizes that this is one of their traits and takes advantage of it and doesn't allow them to rest. And what that person is doing is evil. And the ISTJ also needs to like step up and be like, no, I have boundaries. And this is, I'm saying no, which is tough for them. But to recognize and to get feedback from the other people around them, like a disinterested third party, that like so-and-so is taking advantage of you and your work ethic. Yeah.
Especially when it comes to family. Well, for family, all of us are affected, but especially ISTJs in
Yes.
terms of that. On another note too, I find ISTJs really care about stability and having security in their lives, whatever way they end up building that too. And so those are some general qualities of the type. And so to wrap things up, thank you so much, Dario, for coming out today. Feel free to check out Radiance House and his book, The 64 Subtypes. And so we'll see you all in the next one.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.